I talk in the book about making a covenant with limit because I don't think that's encouraged anymore with all the free credit cards and the you can be anybody you want and all of that kind of thing. Actually, myths say something very radical, very unfashionable. You are meant to be something quite specific. You're not meant to be a million different things. You're meant to trade growth for depth. So what I mean by that is growth is a wonderful thing. I've grown, but when it's a kind of hysterical growth that the internet and modern media encourages, you become 3 miles wide, 2 inches deep, you know? And I'm always looking for something that has greater depth.
Welcome to Passion Struck. Hi, I'm your host, John R. Miles, and on the show, we decipher the secrets, tips, and guidance of the world's most inspiring people and turn their wisdom into practical advice for you and those around you. Our mission is to help you unlock the power of intentionality so that you can become the best version of yourself. If you're new to the show, I offer advice and answer listener questions on Fridays. We have long-form interviews the rest of the week with guests ranging from astronauts to authors, CEOs, creators, innovators, scientists, military leaders, visionaries, and athletes. Now, let's go out there and become Passion Struck. I am absolutely thrilled today to welcome Dr. Martin Shaw to Passion Struck. Welcome, Martin. How are you today?
I'm well, John. Glad to be here.
I'm speaking to you, and you are in one of the most picturesque parts of the world I've ever been to. I love the western part of England. And when my grandparents lived in Cheltenham, I used to love to go visit them and see all the villages and the cottage life in that part of the world. As I sit here in Clearwater, Florida, I'm a little bit jealous that you get to live in such a picturesque place.
Oh, John, that's a nice thing to say. This is the Celtic fringe of Britain. So there is a little bit of Roman imprint here, but by and large, they gave up. We get to a town called Exeter or a city called Exeter, and they said, that's enough. And from from then on in, you move from Devon into Cornwall and then a little leap across the Irish Sea into Ireland. Also, interestingly, today in the Eastern Orthodox tradition is Christmas Day. So in my faith, I've literally just walked out of church. We've had double Christmas. In The Hobbit, I think in Lord of the Rings, they have something called second breakfast, but we have second Christmas, you know.
I love it. So do you get a second Boxer Day or only one?
No, I don't think so. I think for most people, by the time you're well into January, as we are now, there's a certain amount of psychological fatigue at the notion of being hurled back into, the great flourishing of Christmas. But actually, to be the other side of all the glitter and a quieter way and have a religious ceremony is very beautiful. So it's good, but I think most of us are not mad for, more partying.
Well, Martin, as I was preparing for this interview, I was intrigued because you and I had very different upbringings. As I understand it, you grew up without a television, surrounded instead by books and stories. What did that kind of childhood do to your imagination, especially compared to the screen saturated world we find ourselves in today?
Well, I must hasten to add, any chance I got to be in front of a screen as a nipper, I would have gone for it. But that would have been the cinema, which I'm still a huge fan of the movies. So the cinema was an almost overwhelming event as a kid. You come out, you're kind of walking differently after seeing a Western or seeing Star Wars. But I didn't have that. My grandparents had a telly, so I got a little dose of it at the weekend. But sure enough, I lived in a house where you could call it oral culture really mattered. My father still is a really good preacher. And so the house was filled with him learning sermons. It was filled with him speaking or beginning to have a crack at speaking kind of embryonic Greek and Hebrew. My mum is a wonderful storyteller. It's a language. Language was wealth. That would be the way I would describe it. And I remember when my friends would come in, I think I only did this once, but I would have a piece of cardboard and I'd say, okay, this is the television. And I'd frantically draw images. There's a video of Bob Dylan doing that with writing, I'm just remembering from the 60s. And you'd write things. And so in other words, I had a kind of free range, uncorralled imagination. It it was no longer dictated to me through films that I could stop and start. I had to do a lot of work in my own head.
Yeah, I love that. And I know a lot of people today, including myself, encounter myths either through our religious encounters, or often people have encountered it through the work of Joseph Campbell. But for a listener who's tuning in today, what's the difference between a myth and a story? Because they're not the same.
No, they're not. One of the things that you could say about a myth usually at some embryonic level describes how we got here in the shape that we are. In other words, there's usually some sort of creational fundament to it, even if nobody listening to it is digesting it in the same way that you do a shopping list. We're looking for a kind of poetic reasoning rather
Yes.
than just the facts of the matter. So myths are usually sacred stories, whereas a story and storytelling is such a broad term. It can mean many, many different things. There are stories when you're walking from one Scottish village to another and you've got 6 miles and it's starting to rain, and you need short little zippy stories that are full of feasting. And that encourages you to get from one village to the other. But then come the winter, come around now, actually, January, you would be looking for a saga. You'd be looking for Beowulf. You'd be looking for the Poetic Edda. You'd be looking for an Arthurian tale. And those are stories that just have a greater wingspan. There are some stories, fairy tales, you can almost put them in your pocket. It's a lovely thing to have a story that's 2 or 3 pages long. But for example, I spent a lot of time with a story of the Holy Grail called Parsifal. Funnily enough, that story was one of Joseph Campbell's absolute favorites. He wrote about it all the time. Now, that story, even in a book, is 411 pages. So that's an entirely different proposition to a fairy tale that is 3 or 4 paragraphs. But I would say, yeah, myths have a sense of the sacred about them. They have a sense of putting together quite how we got here. They're the stories that bring the tribe together and remind them of who they are.
Yeah, and I kind of think of a myth as something that is passed down verbally from like generation to generation. It's not something I would find it very hard, if not impossible, to kind of create in my own original story. It's kind of something that's shaped and expanded upon over time. Is that a good way to think about it?
A very good way to think about it. And what that brings up would be a question probably that many modern people have. They'd say, well, surely Lord of the Rings is a myth. Isn't that a myth? And I would say, no, that's a mythic story. It's an incredible, beautiful, powerful, life changing mythic story. But you are hitting again. The thing about Joseph Campbell, people are rude about Campbell because of the degree of his success. It makes people uncomfortable how many wise things he said in one lifetime. And one of the things Campbell would have said is myth means no author. And you just kind of said that myth means no author. It's not somebody hunched over a laptop doing a Harry Potter or being J.K. Rowling, whoever else it is. Those are Jeanette Winterson. These are powerful writers, and I'm incredibly grateful for them. But myth has its roots in oral culture and orality and storytelling. And that makes modern people nervous because we do rather like the one version. People are always looking for well, what's the absolute first version of this story? And you can dig a little bit, but obviously, if I was coming to your village or your town or Florida, where I was only 18 months ago, lots of crocodiles, lots of heat, lots of Greeks, very nice. I enjoyed it. However, if I turned up 150 years ago in Florida and told a fairy tale that there was no book available that it was in, you've only heard it once. And so it would be your civic function to retain that story and then tell it about a week later to your pals that couldn't make the event. And then they try and retain it. And then they drive 100 miles away, tell it to their grandparents, who tell it to somebody else. And so you get a kind of catalogue of whispers. And the story imaginatively stays lively because it's clearly the same story, but there's all sorts of ornamental little bits and garnishes that weren't there when I turned up that one time and told it.
Yes, it kind of gets added and
Yeah.
expanded upon.
Yeah, it's a recipe. I've said this a million times. There's a phenomenal storyteller called Gioia Timpanelli, a Sicilian American woman. And she always said to me, she was very kind. She sort of spotted me when I was younger and was kind enough to encourage me. And she said, think of stories, old fairy tales, rather like a recipe handed down in the family. And you should loyally try and cook it in the way that your auntie cooked it. But if after 100 grindings of the herbs, you happen to discover smoked paprika and it adds and it tastes sublime, well, that's your little contribution. But storytelling in its most efficacious form is a combination of tradition and innovation, sense and matter. The matter of the story is the bones of the story. The sense of it is what you do as the storyteller, your particular turns of phrase that evening. And a lot of that's depending on, like, have you had enough sleep? Are you digesting a steak? Were you foolish enough to have a glass of whiskey beforehand? All of these bad things, that they all influence the telling.
Martin, as I was preparing for this, I learned that you and I both share a deep love of music. And
Yeah.
you've used this great image of myth as a kind of mosh pit, something you don't politely observe, but you get
Oh,
thrown
stop
into.
it, John. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I've got a philosophical question for you. What happens to a human being when they actually enter the mosh pit instead of standing at the edge?
What happens is you realize that life is a contact sport. That's what happens. Life is a contact sport, and it is full of jeopardy, filled with excitement, and the capacity for peril is everywhere. So, you can get a thump on the nose in a mosh pit, but you can also get dragged off the ground by your comrade when you fall over. So everything is happening in quick time. And the mosh pit, when you dare to love, you've entered a mosh pit, you've entered a contact sport. And I would suggest probably that as you get older, a 45-year-old in the mosh pit is not as comfortable. It's not as natural an environment as a 17-year-old. And it might be as you're aging, you want to think more about tango or flamenco or something with a few particular steps to it that does involve the contact, but it's a little more ritualized than the absolute free for all of the mosh pit. But that's where I grew up. I would have been a drummer. I still drum.
I
And from
drum too.
Oh,
How about
really?
that?
Are you a
Yes.
kit player?
Yes.
Oh, really? What do you play? What kit do you play?
I play pearls.
Oh, lovely. Beautiful, beautiful kit. Yeah, at the moment I play Gretsch. I used to play Ludwig, but all of those old wonderful Slingerland, they're fantastic. But I mean, to be honest, sorry, we're digressing slightly, but the standard of drums is so high everywhere. It's quite rare to have a bad kit these days, providing you've got a drum key and you know how to tune it. But anyway, yeah, so I was a young rock and roller really in the kind of mid to late 80s. I left school with an absolute impoverishment of qualifications. I had nothing. And so I was either working in sporadic little bits of work in factories and video shops, and a lot of time touring with, what these days we think of as punk rock bands.
Well, you and I discussed this before, but I'm jumping off a camera here for those who are watching. But you and I also share a huge love for a common band, the Waterboys, and our favorite album. This is the Sea. I couldn't find
Oh,
it. I was going through my record collection. I couldn't find it. But when I think about their music, there's something mythical about This
yeah.
Is the Sea, especially
Oh,
like
yeah.
this longing, devotion. What do you think music does that myth and religion also try to do when it's done right?
Well, in the language of the Waterboys, all those things expose us in their fullness to something that Mike Scott, the singer from the Waterboys, would call the big music. The big music. And the big music really is an experience of awe. It's an experience of what James Joyce used to call aesthetic arrest, when your heart has a kind of murmuration and it's not something that you like, it's something that you love. Now, the Waterboys are a very interesting case in point. They're still functioning to this day. They are a terrific kind of Celtic tinged rock and soul band. Mike Scott is an incredibly prolific fellow. But there's no doubt about it. The records that you just showed me, and I appreciate that they're records, not CDs or tapes or downloads, vinyl, God bless vinyl.
Got to listen to the Water
Yeah.
Boys on vinyl.
Something very, very special happens around This Is the Sea, Fisherman's Blues, Pagan Place, Room to Roam. There's a phrase in the Anglican Church, they say, God has his hand on that man or that woman. And for a moment, there was something just coming through Mike Scott. His solo album, Bring 'Em All In, is also phenomenal. I love it to a degree that his fiddle player is a guy called Steve Wickham. And Steve Wickham, I was walking through Dublin last Christmas, this is a year ago, and I just on my phone recorded a message of how phenomenal Steve Wickham's fiddle playing it's a sound that brings tears to my eyes. And I sent this message out, and within about 10 minutes, Wickham had replied on Instagram and was saying, well, I'm proud to be a little bit of the big music, but it belongs to all of us. So music, I remember being 3 or 4 years old and hearing a piece of classical music, Vaughan Williams, Fantasia on a theme for Thomas Tallis. Vaughan Williams again, The Lark Ascending. If you haven't heard them, go listen to this stuff. Arvo Part, John Coltrane, A Love Supreme. These are things, Miles Davis, Kind of Blue. I mean, it just goes, Talk, Spirit of Eden. It goes on and on. There's nothing like music. I mean, music is music, What I didn't know about when we were kids, John, was the notion of the storyteller. I just sort of didn't know these people really existed. I knew wonderful older ladies in libraries would read, but there's a difference between reading a book and telling a story from memory. So in other words, it's not a recital. It hasn't been memorized. It's something that is living in the imagination of the person standing in front of you. I was lucky enough to be privy to it through my dad a lot, but my dad does it unconsciously, really. He doesn't know that he's doing it particularly. But I would have had no idea, for example, the kind of work that I do now. No one at school, there was no mental place for that, other than had we been raised in Ireland, for example, in the west of Ireland, there's a tradition of somebody called a shanachie. And a shanachie is a traditional storyteller. It's usually a man, could be a woman, often speaking in Gaelic, and they are what you could call a cultural historian of a place. They know the folk tales of the place. They know the gossip of the hedgerows. They know the ecology of their place, and they know the big myths as well. And the way they would earn a living is by knocking at your door. You'd know who they were. They come in, sit by the fire, and if they're compelling enough, they'll start the architecture of a story which is going to last 7 days, and you feed them and water them for those 7 days, and they get well looked after. It's stories that do it.
I love it. And I wanted to go through this conversation with you because what we're going to be talking about today is all about myths. I was so excited when the folks from Penguin Random House introduced me to your work, and especially your brand new book, Liturgies of the Wild, which we're going to explore today. And I think what we've been discussing really sets up the book, because as I was reading it, you open up by situating myth not as metaphor or entertainment, but the way I would explain it is the technology for becoming fully human, which really ties into what I love to talk about on the show, human flourishing. But you argue that today we have a modern crisis. It's not a lack of information, but mythic starvation. Can you explain that?
Yes. Do you know, as you were just saying that, John, I was thinking to myself, probably for the first time in culture, we have too many stories, perhaps. Perhaps there's a tyranny of choice that we're actually experiencing. There's a kind of a la carte kind of stories being hurled at us every day specifically through our screens. And so what happens is myths as sacred stories seem to be in rather short supply, but a kind of toxic myth or a toxic mimicry of stories are everywhere, designed to encourage the sale of a certain item, a certain kind of lifestyle. Instagram is filled with stories of people with very, very shiny teeth looking terrifically healthy and successful. And that hits for us the illusion of scarcity, that we simply don't have enough. And when you do get mythic themes, so you might get a mythic theme in a Marvel movie, etc., I appreciate that, but I would see it as a facsimile or a photocopy of the real thing.
You know what strikes me, and I'm going to just give my interpretation of some of Campbell's work, is he tries to explain, I think, why new religions are born or new interpretations of religion are reborn. And it kind of says what ends up happening is that myths have been told, but people don't understand as time goes on the relevance of the myth because they've kind of become old compared to where life is at now. I'm not sure if I'm using the right words, but do you think part of the reason myths aren't as relevant as they used to be today is because people can't relate to them in the language of the life that we're living today?
Yes, to a degree. To a degree. I I think most people picking up the Bible, if you were under the age of 30, you're going to find that some fairly obscure territory unless you have a decent commentary or a few people around you who can help unpack quite what it is you have in front of you. I also think that I think our attention spans have gone insane. We don't have
Yeah.
attention spans anymore. And so that's the covenant that you have to make with a myth is a covenant of imagination and concentration. You have to show fidelity to the story for as long as it's going to take. And actually, the good news is that if you leave me alone with modern folk and let me at them, you'd be amazed at their recall instantaneously. The moment you say, right, turn your phones off, I'm going to tell you a story for an hour, you'd think they'd be twitching in their seat and reaching for this. And actually, once they've got the memo that we're on hiatus from that, their old aboriginal concentration lurches back up pretty quickly. So I'm not despairing about it, but I'm certainly concerned because it's a very real thing. It's a thing in my own life. One of the things that I've done a bit of in the last year, because I recognized my own concentration was deteriorating, is fairly often I will learn a poem by heart just for the labor of getting the thing in my head and then on my tongue. And it takes me a surprisingly long time, to be honest. I'm slightly embarrassed at how long it takes me, but I would recommend to anybody, if you feel that your phone is eating you alive, there's a whole bunch of things you could do, including throwing it in a lake or smashing it with a hammer. But if you want to keep some kind of connection to the wider world, as I do, why not make sure that every now and then you learn? W.B. Yeats would be a great poet to go to, the Song of Wandering Angus. I went to the Hazelwood because a fire was in my head. Or to learn one of these Grimm's fairy tales that we were just mentioning. But one way or another, keep working. I describe myth sometimes as a yoga of the imagination, a flexing, a turning, a bending. Sometimes it's a boxing match of the imagination. It's a bit more pugilistic. But one way or another, don't be passive. In the book Liturgies of the Wild that's just about to come out, it's divided up into chapters, and the chapter could be on limit, on evil, on shame, on passivity, on praise making. And with every chapter, I'm trying to take one of these themes and seeing, well, how does this look like in a modern person's life? How does it look like in a fairy tale and a myth? How can somebody that comes to me and says, I've lost all direction, I'm heartbroken, I'm very jaded, I have no idea what to do? Well, I'll listen to the conditions of their story, but rather than just mirroring that story back to them, I listen for the moment in their disclosure where I suddenly hear a fairy tale.
Hmm.
And you go, okay, oh yeah, that reminds me of a story called The Handless Maiden. Once upon a time, there was this guy. Boom. And you're in. And to some degree, they are less lonely at that moment, because they go, oh, okay, this place where I feel so isolated, so unseen, so unwitnessed, probably quite frightened, is a familiar forest within myth. Other people have been here. Other people have got out the other end of this thing. They may have even flourished, but we do not have enough of those stories around at the moment. There is a deficit for sure.
A couple of things that came to my mind as you were talking. One, when you brought up Yeats, I'm not sure why, but my head went to the Smiths song Cemetery Gates, where Morrissey is talking about Keats and Yeats are great, but Wilde is on his mind. And then when you were talking about the Bible, I have to agree with you. I grew up Catholic. In fact, I went to parochial school from the time I was in kindergarten until the time I finished high school. Yet I don't think I ever learned the Bible. I think I learned what the Catholic Church kind of programmed in for the week that we were studying. And it wasn't until I was in my mid 30s and I was attending a Methodist church that I went through a 34-week program called Discipleship One, where you go through the whole Bible, and it's pretty intensive. It was like getting a master's degree because we met with our minister twice a week for 2 to 3 hours as we were reading the Bible. And I got very lucky because not only did he have a doctorate in theology, he also had a doctorate in history. And so he was able to take these stories from centuries ago and he was able to relate them to modern times, which was the first time I ever really had that connection between the myths that were told centuries ago and how they relate to us today. So I felt very lucky. But where I want to go from this is when we first started this passage, you said really that there's no one in the world who's not carrying a story. But I think what's happening today, as you write, is that too many of our stories are being crumpled like a bus ticket. And what's happening, I think, is so many people today are wearing a mask covering who they really are instead of being proud when they look in the mirror when they wake up of the story that they've created. And long way around asking you this question of what determines whether a person treats their story as treasure or, like so many people are doing, are throwing it away.
Great question. You are talking about the difference between persona, masks, and presence. Presence, in other words, your capacity to be fully yourself. I was lucky enough to be in the presence recently of the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams. And he said an interesting thing to me. He said, when on your 300th birthday you fall down dead, you will find yourself in front of God. And God will say to you, not, Martin, why were you not more like Martin Luther King? Martin, why were you not more like Mother Teresa? He'll say, why were you not more like Martin Shaw? Why did you not work on that little bit of genius that I put in everybody to blow on the embers to come to fullness? Why didn't you do that? So, in the first half of life, the notion of a mask is very innate and natural because we move out into a rather scary world. We go to school, we may not feel safe at home. There's all sorts of societal pressures that are put on us. So we need innately a certain degree of disguise because we don't know who we are yet. We don't know what our innate nature is. And so there is a little bit of a sense of a dressing up box, possibly for a long time. And you go, oh, great, now I'm a policeman. Thank goodness. I'm okay. I'm a cop. I can rest behind being a cop, or I can be a professor. And then you are a professor for a bit and you're like, well, I'm kind of a professor, but actually who's the guy that was there before I got the certificate or got the qualification? And then if you are lucky enough to get to midlife, especially if you're lucky enough to have a life of reasonable length, a lot of people begin to become more interested in this notion of presence, like who am I really? This is a poem by a guy called William Stafford. He says, maybe I'm a king, maybe I'm a king, even in the robberies of the rain, maybe I'm a king. And that is why, for example, a lot of my work, I don't get tons and tons and tons of young people because they're just not at that stage yet. At the moment, the masks are working fine for them because society at large is mask orientated. and celebrates that. But of course, the idea of a midlife crisis probably underneath that is saying, gosh, this is not fitting, this is not serving me anymore. I've got to get to something realer. And that is, I think, when I always encourage, as my mentors encouraged me, take your own story seriously. And as my teacher, Robert Bly, used to say, who was a friend of Joe Campbell's, he used to say, tell the story of your own life and bit by bit cut out the lies. Cut out the lies.
Yeah, what you just said is so interesting. I had a gentleman on this program a couple years ago. His name isn't important, but he was at the time like 18 years old and just lost in life. He grew up in Switzerland, and somehow or another, he miraculously becomes a Swiss guard, and he's guarding Pope John Paul II, who becomes a mentor to him. And what you were just saying is exactly what the Pope ended up telling him. He could see how lost he was and how he was walking through life wearing a mask that was completely hiding who he was underneath it. And he made the point to him that you're chasing the wrong thing. What God put you here to do is he made you a beautiful creation, and you have superpowers that only you possess that can make a real difference in the world. And your goal in life is to use those superpowers for good. What the Dalai Lama continues to, I think, to try to say, and so eloquently. And so many of us don't learn that lesson until, like you're saying, in midlife. I just had Mark Nepo on the show, and we were talking about the second half of life. And he was arguing, similar to you, that humans are made of stories, not just influenced by them. But what happens is we live in a culture where people are fed stories that aren't helping them mature in life. And you've got to bust through that to see your innate value in the world. Kind of paraphrasing our interview, but sounds very similar to what you discuss in the book.
I think so. In the Bible, I think it's Paul says you have to learn to test the spirits of the age. Test the spirits of the age. And not everything out there is wishing you well. And not every story you are getting spun is necessarily very accurate. I probably have a very particular kind of encounter with how America looks at the moment because of European media. And at the same time, probably friends of mine in America have a very different view of what England looks like than I do actually living here. So I think discernment is important. I also think if you can handle it, limit the degree or show discernment about the voices you choose to listen to. Because if you allow yourself from the moment you turn your phone on in the morning or pick your phone up, most people don't even bother turning it off anymore. You are in a kind of Ouija board of voices. You're in a kind of seance of information, much of which doesn't have any real true nutrition. It's designed to make you anxious, and then it's designed to make you purchase. I've never thought of that. Yeah. Anxiety to purchase, really. And oh, okay, if I get this, then that'll stop happening and I'll feel a little bit better.
Martin, I'm going to go back to the Waterboys here for a second.
Please.
So one of the Waterboys' most famous songs is "Hole of the Moon,"
Yeah.
and I was listening to you talk on an interview this morning, and you were mentioning this idea that in America, parts of Western culture, we've kind of the words that come to me are like we've hidden the moon from its true purpose. I'm probably not saying it correct, but you were
Yeah.
referencing an Eastern philosopher and Eastern culture about
Yeah.
how they view the moon.
Mm.
But I want to tie this into your chapter 2, where you're talking about bones,
Oh, yeah.
because I think there's some connection between the two, and maybe you can take it from there.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Well, the thing you're mentioning, actually, I had an encounter with a Chinese artist called Ai Weiwei, Chinese dissident artist, very famous, and he'd actually been disappeared by the Chinese government for several months and just stuck in a room. And sort of tortured, really. But anyway, I was writing a catalogue for him a few years ago. I was writing an essay for his catalogue of art. And as I was leaving, he said this strange thing to me. He said, "Tell the West we want the moon back." And he wasn't talking about boots on the moon. He was talking about the great symbolic value of the moon, the difference between daylight and moonlight. I mentioned at the beginning of this that I've been telling Grail stories. Well, some Grail stories are what I would call sunlight tellings, and some Grail stories are moonlight tellings. This is the Sea, going back to the Waterboys. That is a tremendously moonlit album. And of course, this is the sea. I mean, if we're thinking about the sea now, of course, it's connected to the tides and it's connected to the moon, La Luna. Yeats was a great fan of the moon. But yeah, that's about all I would have to say about that. What else would you like me to say about Bones of Initiation?
Well, I think what bones represent is they are what lingers after illusion falls away.
Yeah,
And so there are things like our ancestral memory, our inheritance. And I often talk on this show about the choices that we make. Bones to me are the deep structures that shape us before choice enters the picture. And I think so many people think it's these large events in life that end up shaping us. And I contend it's more the choices that we make that lead us to the large moments in life that truly shape us. It's those micro choices. And a lot
yeah.
of this is some of us ignore our bones and some of us hold on to our bones for too long, that both cases, they influence the choices that we make.
I was talking to my daughter actually. She's at home for a bit now after Christmas. And I was saying to her, nothing is wasted in your life if you choose to pay attention. There's no wasted experience. If you're interested in writing or thinking or being an artist or simply being a human being, prowl round something you've been through. I often give this a strange, I say, give it 12 secret names, look at it from 12 different angles, and you'll very soon move out of a victim posture and into something that is a little bit more nourishing. Funnily enough, in the notion of bones, I don't think I get to it in Liturgies of the Wild, but I've written, it's probably unpublished so far. You forget when you've written a few books what is and isn't in your book. I talk about the difference between flesh memory, skin memory, and bone memory. And skin memory is what you put on the CV to get the job application. Flesh memory is your appalling divorce or your 2 terms in Iraq or whatever it was, something that really formed you. But then bone memory is down in the mythic structures. It's down in the mythic structures of things. And it's why I can tell Psyche and Eros for a couple of days. Very old, ancient story. And people are fully engaged with it because in some strange way, it speaks to this primordial gloop called the soul, which nobody quite understands. We have theories about the soul. We have an instinct for the soul, but we don't quite know what it is, thank goodness. As soon as people tell me emphatically what the soul is, I have no interest in it whatsoever because you've lost the mystery at that point. But bones, yeah. Over to you.
So I am a veteran. And for those who have served, regardless of where you serve, initiation is a very important part of being in the military. That's why SEALs go through basic underwater demolition school. It's why Rangers go through Ranger school. It's why every person who serves goes through some form of boot camp. And even fraternities and sororities have initiations that they put people through, because initiation is a deliberate shaping of a human being through ordeal, through thresholds, like we see in the military. But you argue in the book that modern culture is avoiding initiation more and more and more. And what it's doing is it's leaving people biologically adult, but spiritually adolescents. So without initiation, what happens when we are faced with adversity?
We are unnecessarily tortured by it. Now, adversity, I would never go looking for adversity. I would never fetishize initiatory experience because initiatory experience generally is rather unpleasant. and leaves you feeling disorientated. And it kind of reaches into you and says, okay, what are you going to do now? What are you going to do now with the whole world turned upside down? But in traditional rites of passage, an initiation was an orchestrated crisis. It was an orchestrated crisis because everybody knows that even in the kind of extremely affluent and fortunate world that most of us are living in terms of access to medicine and healthcare and things like that, if we have that, you're still going to get bitten at some point. You're still going to hit something that is absolutely terrifying. And stories, myths, rites of passage, initiation encounters where you basically have a kind of choreographed wrestle with death, but with elders around you to pull you out to make sure that that doesn't become, it doesn't move from symbolically fatal to literally fatal.
Yeah.
You don't have any of that. You're simply unprepared for the moment that you get pushed into the dark waters. You're unprepared. And again, in myth, this is called experiences of the underworld. And interestingly, I notice I have colleagues and friends of mine who can become addicted to disorder in their life. They almost become proud of it, especially if, like me, they're a little bit arty. They go, hey, come on, how can you say I'm not initiated? I'm on my third divorce, man. And I'm saying, well, no, that's you. You're on a 2-step, not a 3-step program. You've never stepped to the end of this. You've never seen this. You've never seen this ordeal to the end of the sentence. Good, yeah, like a prison sentence. So I was lucky enough. I've worked with veterans on and off. I haven't done it for a few years, but coming to America and working specifically at men's events, by nature, you were just going to meet a lot of vets. You were going to meet a lot of people, especially who'd come out of Vietnam, the older fellas, and then the younger ones who had come back from, the middle or the Far East. And you will be deeply familiar with this idea that if you were pulled out of a combat situation very quickly, and then immediately you're at a barbecue in Texas 48 hours later with your kids hanging off you, that is disorientating. And the notion of the bends, when you come from the deep water and you're pulled up, and if it happens too quickly, you lose your stirrups. You're not it needs to be a slow, ritualized, in the best sense of the word, therapeutic process. And if you go back to the Irish myths, we're talking a lot about Ireland and Celtic world today. Cuchulainn, the great warrior, when Cuchulainn would come back to the village, the women would stand in a line and they would bare their breasts to him. Now, interestingly, people have a smile when I tell that bit of the story because they assume it's some sort of erotic moment for Cuchulainn. But the first time they did this to Cuchulainn, he was a child. The reason they're doing it is not showing the breast in its sort of erotic possibility. They're showing that they're mothers. They're showing that he sucked on their pap, and it's the milk and it's the nurture and the village, not the battlefield. Of course, a great story that people have done a lot of work with on this is Odysseus, the Odyssey, trying to get home.
Yeah. In my first book, Passion Struck, I have this chapter that kind of goes into conscious living versus unconscious living. And I contend that most people today are living unconsciously. And I use this analogy that I love playing pinball. Anyone who likes the game of pinball realizes that it's a very complex game because it's made up of mini games underneath it. But what I think is happening today is that so many of us are the pinball in the game instead of the player of the game. And we're allowing ourselves to be bounced around and we're not taking control. And my reason that I bring this up is we become spectators of life instead of being the force that shapes it. And it reminded me of your chapter 5 on
Mm,
passivity, because you're right. I mean, what I got from this chapter is passivity is not peace, it's an abdication.
yeah.
And what's happening is the avoidance that so many of us are doing in our modern lives is a disguise. And you argue that myths demand participation, risk, and response. So, what happens when we keep remaining passive and we refuse to take that ownership of our lives and our spiritual agency?
Well, we become, again, we're back in the dressing up box, because to the rest of the world, we may look very active. Most of us are not passive in every quadrant of our life, but there's a part of it, rather like a fairy tale, where someone's deeply asleep or enchanted. And I know real go-getters who have married women, for example, and the women are tremendously creatively active and in the community, and the man is rather sort of zombified, shuffling around after them, but he has shown tremendous tenacity in earning money, which should be respected and understood and seen. I think for many men, bringing money home to your beloveds, that's an act of love. And it's really painful, actually, when that money just zips into a bank account and no one ever sees it. You feel like you want to come home with a suitcase, or a sack of gold, actually, would be better. So I think we all have areas of passivity, and it's worth saying, okay, where do I find myself asleep? For an opposite illustration to something I just said, I would know many people that have a gift for art but are tremendously passive when it comes to knowing what to charge for their paintings.
Oh,
They
yes.
kind of they fall into an inertia because it's not politically correct to have an eye about what you're actually worth. And so that's where the passivity is. So it's worth tracking. Most people, as I said, are not passive in every area, but there is somewhere where they are enchanted or abdicated, or, as again, we're thinking about Joseph Campbell today, we've abdicated the adventure.
So, in this next chapter, which you know I have to go into on passion, you write that I've recently noticed a lack of new love songs on the radio, songs
Yeah,
that celebrate the
yeah.
nuance of the romantic experience. We seem to have replaced the Leonard Cohens and Joni Mitchells, etc.
Mm.
And a lot of people ask me, what do I mean by living a passion struck life? And I think an interview I did with Angela Duckworth really summed it up. I think passion is energy that it can either mature us or it can destroy us. And we were talking about the beginning of her book, Grit, and again, a military reference, but she was talking about West Point cadets going through beast barracks, and that you had to have passion and perseverance in order to get through. And I kind of argued with her, having gone to the Naval Academy. I said, you can have all kinds of passion, but without the right intentionality, you're going to apply it to the wrong things. And I think that this is something that I took from your chapter, that myths don't suppress passion, they train it.
Very well put. Very, very well put. Yeah, passionless life. Well, in a way, we're back to the image of the mosh pit and the flamenco dance. Passion in a man in his 50s or a woman in her 50s is probably not necessarily best expressed in the mosh pit, but in the discipline of learning an art form that has tempos and patterns. Funnily enough, I was just thinking, you were talking about pinballs. I was wondering if you were a fan of the Who.
Of course.
Yeah. So we're thinking about Mooney, Keith Moon, the great Moon. We're talking about moons.
One of the best
Moon,
drummers
Moon,
of all time.
such a poet. You want to listen to on YouTube, there are recordings of Won't Get Fooled Again, one of the most mind-blowing tracks, where they've just got the drum track and you can hear most of it is improvised and it's poetic. And the Who have been very lucky, actually, in the last 30 years or so. They've had a guy called Zach Starkey playing with them, who is Ringo's son. And Zach Starkey, for me, is one of the most monstrously wonderful modern drummers, who has technique is everywhere these days, but real poetic adventure on the drums seems to be hard to find. But anyway, I'm sorry, I've wildly digressed. We were talking about, where were we going? In other words, in Christianity, you often hear about the passions, and the passions I'm afraid, are often displayed as things that can really wring you dry, if you don't have a discipline to them, if you don't have a I talk in the book about making a covenant with limit, because I don't think that's encouraged anymore with all the free credit cards and the you can be anybody you want and all of that kind of thing. Actually, myths say something very radical, very unfashionable. You are meant to be something quite specific. You're not meant to be a million different things. You're meant to trade growth for depth. So what I mean by that is growth is a wonderful thing. I've grown, but when it's a kind of hysterical growth that the internet and modern media encourages, you become 3 miles wide, 2 inches deep, you know? And I'm always looking for something that has greater depth. For example, you just mentioned him, Leonard Cohen. Leonard Cohen was married. No, he wasn't married. Forgive me. He had briefly had a relationship with Joni Mitchell. And he said, can you imagine getting out of bed every morning and there's Joni at a piano writing, Court and Spark or Blue or any of these unbelievably fantastic pieces of work. He said it makes you, it can put a dent in your mood. That's what he said. However, Cohen has a much more modest garden to Joni's. There's a lot of dark earth in there, but it's maybe 10 foot by 12 foot, but it's very, very deep. And he is not hypnotized by the garden next door. He doesn't look too much in that way. He pays attention to this small mythic bit of ground that is his life. And everybody that is listening to this, I cannot recommend take the conditions of your life seriously. Have a look back. I think you were really onto something, John, where you said it's not always about peak moments or moments of great calamity. It's tiny little moments all the way along. In myth, I call it the breadcrumbs that you pick up. Those in the end dictate a lot of the journey. And if you're not being encouraged to pay attention, William Blake is a great one for paying attention to things. If you're not being encouraged, then you are susceptible to being sort of entranced, actually, a lot of the time.
A few years ago, I did this series of interviews on self-transcendence, and I talked to Scott Barry Kaufman and Andrew Newberg and David Vago and David Vaden, and I ended up talking to Dacher Keltner, and I was trying to explore how we receive awe. And a lot of people think it's from these peak moments, which is certainly a way that you will experience. But I really love Dacher's research because what he found is the way we can most enter into awe or these peak moments is through what he calls moral beauty, which is small acts of kindness that we either observe or we do onto another human being. And to me, it really goes with what you were just saying about those tiny choices that we get to make. And that's how we experience peak moments, even though we don't realize it.
Did you say moral beauty?
Yes, he called it moral beauty.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I like that very much.
My biggest takeaway from reading Liturgies of the Wild is that it's not about learning myths, it's about letting myth make you. So if there was a takeaway you wanted to leave the listeners from your book and our discussion, what would it be about how they should allow myths to make them?
I'll say a few things. First of all, and this is very difficult for modern Western people, if you hear a myth, if you hear an old story, don't tell it what it is. Let it have its way with you, which in a way is what you just said, John, because people often, really old stories can be a bit disorientating, and you want to get to the allegorical point, the 3 points, as quickly as possible. Well, mercifully, myths don't usually work like that. And it's quite all right for a myth to have a ton of questions in it. So it's not just all sewn up. The edges of the tent are flapping a bit in the wind. So don't tell the story what it is. Don't hurry it. Don't stretch it on the rack of infinite progress. But what I do notice is people that have sat with stories for a long time develop a very particular quality, and it's an odd one. It's their capacity to praise. It's their capacity to praise. Many of us can be rather tight-lipped because we are just not living in a culture where do you remember we began with the image of the mosh pit, the
Yep.
notion that this is a relatable universe that is talking to us and we are talking to it, and we begin to forge our own reality when we find around us, lean to the grace, really is what I'm getting at. The stories encourage us to lean to the grace, to raise up what we see is beautiful and of value in other people, that has moral courage to it, notice it. And in the Arthurian metaphor, the barley will be straighter in the field, the salmon will leap higher in the river. In other words, you know, be these myths. These are not just clothes that you're trying on. You're caught in a great dreaming, would be the old Aboriginal idea of it. And it's not as if an old story has to make sense to you from beginning to end, but there'll be a moment in the story, there'll be an image in the story that is trying to prompt your soul into communication. Follow that image home, see where it leads you.
And I will just close on what you just said with another take I had from the book, and that is, we often think in life, what does freedom really look like? And what I really took away from how you framed it is, freedom is not found through excess, it's found through limit.
Yeah,
And what
yeah,
myths really teach us is restraint, fasting, like you talked about, rhythm, and patience. Limits create the depth, the attention, and the meaning that so many people are missing in their lives today. And what they're finding is that their life is becoming thin and frantic because of it. Well, Martin, enjoyed having you so much today. It was such an honor. What
great.
an incredible book. Where is the best place people can learn more about you?
Well, if you just go online and Google Dr. Martin Shaw, you will immediately come to a website. It's the first thing you're going to see, and you'll find some biography about me. You'll find I have a school that is over 20 years old. People come and study with me in England. It's not a school like Hogwarts. You're not there all the time. You come and go. There's a school. The most important thing is, if there's anything at all in this conversation that you've enjoyed, and this is the small copy, the big one is about to arrive. I'm not sure whether or not this will come out before February. I have no idea what your scheduling is like, but pre-sales are phenomenally important. I never knew this, but they're the thing between between a book quietly going away and getting serious visibility. So if you have it in your heart to pre-order the book, either in your local bookstore or Amazon or wherever you get your books, that would be something.
Well, thank you very much, Martin, for joining me, and congratulations on the launch of this book. And I hope you get many pre-sales.
Thank you, John. Appreciate that.